Hi, everybody. It's Wednesday early evening, and I want to make what I hope is a shorter rather than longer lecturette. And I'm emphasizing that "et" there because I hope it is more of a lecturette than it is a lecture. I want to talk with you briefly about the solution focused needs assessment process that you're going to be doing with me on Thursday and Friday. It's Wednesday evening. As I said, we had our last class of the week a couple of hours ago. And I want to do a lecture on the process you'll be doing, the solution focused needs assessment process, so that ideally you can take a look at it. It'll be short enough that you can look at it, digest it, and be ready to roll tomorrow or Friday when you are meeting with me. I'm going to, let's see if I can make this happen. I'm going to get a PowerPoint up here, a PowerPoint deck up here, and walk through the PowerPoint on video. Let's hope that I do it right. Give me a minute here. I'm going to check to make sure that this is recording. Yep, it looks like it's recording. All right, crossed fingers. All right, so the solution focus process, SF stands for solution focus. And this is a process by which we assess training needs. Now, remember, this is actually part of a two-part process for trying to figure out an answer to the question, what's our training going to contain? What's our training going to look like? Why are we doing this training? And the first part is this SF, solution focus needs assessment process. The second step is the EDIPT design thinking process. We're not worrying about that right now. We're only worrying about the four-step SF needs assessment process. And that's the one you're going to be walking through with me tomorrow, Thursday, and Friday. I believe it's the 11th and 12th. Some of you on one day, some of you on the other. Now, don't feel like you're going to be handicapped in some way if you don't get the process 100% as of the start time of your interview, because I will be coaching you. I'll walk you through the interview. Now, I sent around some information about how the interviews are going to flow, and I'm going to be role playing a manager who is your interviewee, and you're finding out what kind of needs the organization has, and then you're going to be using that information you're going to be using that information in part to design the training, and then the EDIPT stuff that you're going to do, the empathize, in particular, the empathize phase that you're going to be doing with the 105 students. Between the interview with me and the empathize phase of the EDIPT process, you're going to have plenty of information to know exactly what you want to do with the training, and all that's kind of going to be left really is decision making about what activities to do, what talking points to include in your lecturettes, and so forth. So let's get down to it. An overview of the process first. So it's a four-stage process, four-phase process, four steps. I kind of use those words, step, stage, phase. I use them sort of interchangeably. An overview of the process is as follows. The four steps, of course, which we'll talk about in a moment. And it's important to realize the focus of this process is on addressing an issue, solving a problem. You're focusing on the solution. Very limited time is spent dwelling on the problem, finding out the origins of the problem, finding out how often the problem is a problem. All of that kind of focus on the problem stuff is just not necessary. It's the solution focus thinking, the solution focus mindset is, where do we go from here? And that's among other things, that's very economical, because time not spent on all of this past stuff that really can't be changed is time spent on drilling down in depth into what is desired, which means focusing on what we can construct in the future. So in that sense, it's very economical. There's lots we can do with information about what's desired, less we can do with information about all of these matters that reside in the past. And also the solution focus approach to needs assessment is focusing on what's working. And that's important for two reasons. Number one, it tells you kind of how good the organization is. It talks about what in the organization they're doing well, which means you don't have to worry about training that. You can rely on that as something to, possibly build on or build from with respect to the choices you make as to training design. And so those of you who've taken 374, not many of you, but some of you have taken 374, much of this process will be familiar, at least the questions and so forth. The application to training as such, that's not going to be familiar to you necessarily because we didn't go in that direction in 374. But the basic architecture of the process, with one slight exception we'll talk about in a moment. Let's talk about those four phases. The first phase is current conditions. We're going to go into detail in each. Second phase is called desired alternative future. Third phase is strengths already in place. Fourth phase is what's missing. And it's that fourth phase that's a little bit different in the way you learned about this in 374. If you took 374, you'll remember that the fourth phase in 374 is what's next or next steps. So these are the four phases. Now let's talk about them individually. Phase one, the label for this phase, the title is current conditions. It's also called the platform. Some people in the world of SF call it the platform. I certainly use that word myself, but current conditions is a little bit more commonly heard, at least in my classes. And the basic question you're asking in the first phase is you're basically asking what's currently going on in the organization that, all things being equal, you would like to be different. And notice how neutral that is. Notice how it's different from saying, so I understand you got some problems in your organization, so tell me about these problems. That's much different from this, because suddenly by asking it that second way, I'm focusing on the problem. And to focus on the problem is to focus on what's not working well, what's frustrating. It's to focus on what may have happened in the past that led to all of this problem stew. What's the value in that? It's just not that useful, really, when you think about it. It may be interesting and it may be dramatic and intriguing, but it's not that useful. It doesn't play into that consciousness of, so where do we go from here? And that is a fundamental, I think, value of the SF approach to looking at organizations, to looking at organizational change, to looking at facilitating change in organizations, and to look at training in organizations. So what's going on that, all things being equal, you'd rather be different. You don't necessarily have to use those exact words, but you have to keep the music. The music being that affirming, neutral, non-judgmental curiosity about, so what's going on that you'd like to change? And, you can use your own words. Here's an example of a variation. You wanted to meet with us to talk about some conditions that are currently going on in your organization. So tell us about those conditions. You can see how it's the same question, just slightly different language. And you can also hear that it is equally supportive, affirming, reflecting more kind of congenial curiosity than reflecting some kind of search for what's wrong. And this is the vibe that you want to construct in these needs assessment interviews. this kind of congenial curiosity. Oh, that's very interesting to me, or I find that useful. Thank you for telling me that. That's the kind of thing we're wanting to cultivate within you as training specialists who are at one point or other attempting to assess needs. So you want to focus on what's going on, what's happening, and not focus so much on the past, at least in this stage. Obviously, you don't want to focus on what's so forever. You want to actually spend limited time on current conditions, and you're going to be wanting to spend most of your time in the next phase. So the next phase is phase 2. We call that the desired alternative conditions phase. Could call it desired future conditions, could call it the future perfect. That's a term that a lot of SF people use. This is the most important phase for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's most important because it is going to present you with details about what the client wants and needs. Between you and the client, this is the phase in which you sort of start to congeal around, agree upon, mesh with respect to what the desired alternative is going to be once the training is delivered and completed and in the can and behind everybody. In other words, the desired alternative future conditions, think of it as a sort of a checklist. It's a checklist of future conditions that if everyone or almost all of those conditions are met, you got to change in place. No longer those current conditions we talked about a moment ago. No, the desired alternative future is in place once all of these desired alternative details are being experienced. And so that's why this is so important, because it serves as a measuring stick for you and the client to know how effective the training was, to know that the training was effective, to know when the training need has come to an end and perhaps another training need exists. So this is important for that reason. And then also it's also important for a couple of other reasons. But the basic question that you're going to ask is, what would your ideal alternative be to current conditions? That's the basic theme of the question, the vibe of the question. Again, that's the music. You can say it in different words as long as you keep the music. And what you're always looking for in this phase is observable, measurable, actionable, concrete, sensory-specific detail. Another reason that this is important, because I was mentioning a moment ago, there's a couple of other reasons this is an important phase. This is the phase where you train the client. You train the client to express himself or herself in observable, measurable, actionable, sensory-specific, concrete detail. You may or may not want to hold his or her feet to the fire in the current conditions phase along those lines. In fact, the more you do that, the more time you're spending in the current conditions phase. But in this phase, you definitely want to get that person thinking, okay, when this training specialist asks me a question, I got to provide detail. And you want that person to be able to do that. And also, you want the person to want to do that. This is a great opportunity. You can say, oh, that's a great piece of detail. Give me a little more. That was so exactly that specific. I really appreciate that. That's the kind of talk that you want to do so that you will be rewarding the client for observable, measurable, actionable, sensory specific, concrete, actionable detail. Phase 3, the strengths phase, also called resources. Now, we've talked about strengths and resources ever since COM 105. Again, those of you who took 272 or 374 with me, we've talked a lot about strengths in those courses. Well, strengths, same kind of concept here. A strength means a person, a relationship, some knowledge or information, material resources, supplies, funds, any of these affordances, which is a sort of a technical term for this, any of those affordances, those resources that will enable you to move forward in your organizational work, enable the client to move forward rather than get stuck anywhere. A relationship is a resource. You know, you've probably heard in gangster movies, you know, some character will go, you know, I know a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who gets me. Well, what that person's really saying is, I got a resource because he knows this guy, and that guy's a resource because he knows this guy. That's really what's going on there. So a relationship can be a resource. I just had an example in mind that just popped out of my mind. Information's if I recover it, I will. A relationship. I'm sorry. Information is a resource. Here's a good example of kind of both. There was a movie many years ago called Top Gun, which you may have seen. Tom Cruise was in his heyday as a movie star. And the whole idea of Top Gun was the name of a school where Navy fighter pilots went, who already were good fighter pilots, but they went to Top Gun to get better. And that was kind of one of the opening remarks when the guys got to the Top Gun school. And in those days, it was all guys. The director of the school said, "Welcome to Top Gun. All of you are the best of the best in Navy aviation. We're going to make you better." So that's Top Gun. And the idea here is that a person goes to Top Gun to be a really, really good naval aviator, but not just to be a good naval aviator, but part of the mission was to cultivate in these best of the best who get better, cultivate in them the ability and the willingness to go back to their squadrons and teach the other pilots what they learned so that those pilots could be better pilots. So the knowledge that the Top Gun graduate has is a resource for the squadron, the organization, and the relationships that the different other pilots have with the Top Gun graduate. He's got a relationship with this fellow pilot. He's got a relationship with this fellow pilot. He's got a relationship with this commanding officer of the squadron. And those relationships become resources because it is in the context of relationship that a lot of the mentoring and coaching takes place. So here's a good example of what we might think of as some intersecting strengths, intersecting resources, intersecting affordances. And of course, the squadron has other affordances called, you know, funding from the Department of the Navy. Sometimes that affordance is not what it should be or they would like it to be, but in any case, these are all examples of strengths, resources, stuff you can count on that you can take advantage of to move forward where you're wanting to head as an organization. So this is where we want the clients to identify his or her strengths, organizational strengths. And it has to be an actual strength, a measurable, observable, concrete, real strength, not a wish list. Not, you know, if you say, well, tell me some of the strengths of your organization, and the client says, well, you know, what would really help us if we had a really good accountant. It's not good enough. It's not real. You don't have a good accountant yet, so you can't count that as a strength. The whole idea here is you want this observability, measurability, et cetera. And there's a couple of applications. One is you'll know what not to train. If the client tells you about all of these resources, you will know. You don't have to worry about incorporating some module in the training that teaches those. There was an old TV show many years ago called Monty Python's Flying Circus. And it was a British TV show, British comedy show. And one episode, one week, they had this short sketch, 5-minute sketch. And it was these two British guys teaching Italian in a foreign language school. What's so funny about that? Well, all of the students were fluent, native-born Italians from Italy. And there they were in a classroom, and these two teachers are teaching them absolutely basic Italian. And every time they say, okay, now let's work on the present tense, all of the people in the class, these Italians, would go, "Oh, geez, we know that already." And that was what the humor was in the event. Now, if it had been, we're going to teach you how to recite Renaissance Italian poetry, maybe that would have been, something that was missing, something those Italian students didn't know, and they wouldn't be rolling their eyes and going, "We know this already." They'd be going, "Oh, okay, well, I've got to learn that." But knowing what the strengths are of the organization enable you to know what not to train. And it also alerts you to what's going on in the organization that's really useful and good and appreciative, that you can remind trainees of down the road in the actual training room. If the client, the sponsor of the training, the manager you interviewed, said something like, "My people are really enthusiastic," and you're in the training and you're doing an activity and the people are sort of blah, you can say with a little jovial tone in your voice, you can say, "Hey, when I talked to so-and-so, he said you guys are really enthusiastic. Now, I'd like to see some of that enthusiasm. What would have to happen to make that enthusiasm come out?" I would know it because it was said to me that this is a strength it was told to me that this was a strength in the interview. So these are some reasons why we want to pay some attention to these strengths. By the way, if a client says, if you ask for strengths and the client goes to wish list mode, so using that example I gave, if I say, "Well, what are some strengths in your organization?" and the client says something along the lines of, "Well, what would really help is if we had a great accountant." You want to make a note of that because it's possible that this ties into a later phase of the four-step, four-phase process. That's the what's missing phase. And it's possible that if the client slips and goes into wish list mode, you may want to pay attention and not dwell on it, but you may want to pay attention because it's possible that later on that may be a relevant piece of information when you're finding answers to the question of what's missing. Now, I think that'll make a little more sense when we get to that phase. So phase number 3 continued. The basic question you're asking is, what significant strengths do your people already possess? And there's variations on that. There's lots of possibilities. What's already working so well in your organization that we don't need to worry about that today? That's another way of saying the same thing. What does this organization have going for it that does not keep you up at night? I'm not 100% crazy about that because that seems to kind of put a little weight on problem, keeping you awake at night. But it's often amusing. It's very common to talk that way in the world of consulting and training. You're saying to clients, "Well, what keeps you up at night with your organization?" That's just a common sort of phrasing. So, you don't have to hit too hard on it, but it's an option you have, and I actually do kind of like it, but it's variation. These are variations on that basic question. And again, you want to get answers that are observable, actionable, measurable, concrete, sensory specific, take it to the bank, fits in a wheelbarrow. All of these different terms are just ways of saying specificity, specificity, specificity. That's what you're going for. Vague, elusive, that won't work. You got to get down dirty in the mud. You got to get specific, concrete. Okay, phase 4. The label for this phase is what's missing, and I used that already. So think back to how I was talking about that. So the what's missing phase, this is the second most important phase because this narrows your thinking down on what the training content should be. The skeleton of the basic question is, so what's missing? And I say it that way because that's awfully blunt. You're going to need to kind of add a little bit of softening to it. So you might end up saying something like, it sounds as though you got a great deal going for you in this organization. So, given that, what's missing, that we might be able to provide? God, this sounds like a great organization with great people. If there were one thing that you believe we could provide, what would that be? So it's the same question, what's missing, but just said in ways that de-emphasize missing and emphasize you are so close to being perfect. What's that one little keystone that you stick that in and boom, there you go. That's kind of the vibe you want to go for. And finally, you know, closing the interview. Now, this is actually not self-explanatory specifically, but you're going to be able to guess this pretty easily. So I'm not going to dwell on it. But you ask, is there anything else we need to know? Anything else that you want to tell us? I would say actually before that, there would be a segment where you might want to think in terms of, you know, I got just a couple of more questions, and maybe you go back and refresh your memory about something, or you ask for a bit more information about some piece that maybe you didn't get before. You thank the interviewee for all the information that he or she has shared. You say something along the lines of, we're going to put some ideas together. This has been so informative. We're going to put some ideas together and think about where we can go together from this point, and we'll get back to you with them within a week or within 3 days, or whatever the time frame you want to cite is. And then feel free to contact us at any time before that. We're here for you, and say farewell and leave. The last thing I want to talk about is what I call pro tips. So these are just kind of some things to keep in mind that will refine the way you participate in these interviews. The first pro tip is here's some rough time hacks, some rough time chunks that you want to overlay onto the 4-phase process. Now, I might say that we're doing a 30-minute interview, 25, 30-minute interview. This is like kind of the purest, most straight ahead application of the 4-step process. But it's scalable. You could have 2 interviews. You could have 3. I mean, one interview could be about current conditions and desired alternative future. The next interview could be about the other 2. I mean, it's infinitely scalable. About 25 minutes is maybe the least amount of time, 25, 30 minutes. But you could, you know, I've spread out needs assessment interviews to a period of, you know, a couple of days, several days apart. I mean, it's infinitely scalable like that. But in this course, we're just getting down to the absolute pure performance of it, because once you get that down, the scaling upward is not difficult. So for a 20 to 25, 30-minute interview, here's the rough amounts of time you want to spend. So phase 1 should be, you know, 3 or 4 minutes. Phase 2, 10 to 12 minutes. Phase 3, 4 to 5 minutes. Phase 4, 8 or 9 minutes. Again, these are a little bit on the rough side, but what is important is to keep in mind, allow plenty of time for phases 2 and 4. Those are the most important ones. So if phase 1 starts to get toward 5, 6, 7 minutes, you're spending way too much time there. And a couple of other pro tips. You want to take careful notes. And I might say, by the way, at the beginning of the interview, you might want to ask, do you mind if I take notes just to kind of help me remember? In a needs assessment interview, I don't recall ever, and we're talking about decades of doing this, I can never recall someone saying, no, you can't take notes. I've done research interviews, qualitative or ethnographic research interviews as an academic guy, where the respondents have said, no, don't take notes or don't tape record. But never in a needs assessment interview. Notes are, as a matter of fact, if you didn't, it might look bad. So even if you're not inclined to take notes, at least, you know, scribble stuff on the page. But really, seriously, taking notes, I think, is imperative. There's going to be too much information to just keep locked in your brain. So take notes. Don't write every single thing down. Listen for the main points. In 374, we talked about wave tops, meaning kind of the tip of the iceberg. Listen for what the basic ideas are, and the details you don't necessarily have to write down every single detail. What you might want to do is consider setting up your note page in quadrants. It's going to look like this. Here's a facsimile of a 8.5 by 11 standard note page. And, at the top, you got the date and the name and so forth. And then you just divide into 4. And we got current conditions, future conditions, strengths, and what's missing. And you can use those, quadrants to kind of help you keep your thinking straight, keep your notes straight. You may even want to write down the time hacks in there, 3 to 4 minutes, etc. Another pro tip is in your notes and in your comments that you write, in your comments that you make, use the client's words and language as much as you can. To do so shows the client that you're listening, and it shows the client that you're respecting his or her perception of or perspective on the world. An example of this is the Disney Corporation. Years ago, back in the early 90s, I did some consulting work with Disney. It was some organizational development work and also some training work. It was me and another trainer. And early on, we discovered that Disney does not speak of employees, they speak of cast members. So we never said thereafter. We never talked about the employees, we talked about the cast members. Now that's a simple and very obvious example, but the point is well taken. If we had refused to talk about cast members because we thought it was dumb, that would not show respect for the client. If we kept on saying employees, most of you know, I do some work with Marines, have been working with the Marine Corps for like 20 years now. Dr. Olson and I both do it. And many years ago, when we first started doing it, we noticed that the Marines do not say versus. So if they say X versus Y, they don't say that. They say X vice Y. I don't know why, and I've never heard that elsewhere, but that's the organization and that's their language, so that's what we use. So when we're in the training room with Marines, or we're talking with Marines about needs assessment issues, or altering the training in some way, if it comes down to saying versus, we don't say versus. Is this a problem with the logistics department versus the supply department? No, we wouldn't say that. We'd say, is this an issue with the logistics schoolhouse, vice the supply schoolhouse? Schoolhouse is what the Marines call school. So, they have the logistics school, the supply school, et cetera. But they call it schoolhouse for whatever reason. I don't know why. So let's say, yeah, in our schoolhouse, not at our school. All right, fair enough. So we say schoolhouse. So you listen for and use the client's language. And this could be organizational jargon like vice and cast member and schoolhouse, or it could just be the way the client happens to express himself or herself. But listen for how he or she does it and use that language. Secondly, notice what words or phrases light up the client's face. What makes the client sit up in his or her chair, gesture really powerfully, strongly. Those in 374, we learned that those are called alive words. And what you want to do is pay attention to what those are so that you can use them, because you know that if you use them, you're going to really get the client's attention. You're going to be literally and figuratively talking his language or her language. An example of this, many years ago, there was a very famous at the time business book written called In Search of Excellence. And it essentially was a series of interviews with, 40 or 50 different CEOs of extremely successful organizations. And one of the CEOs was a guy named Stewart. And he was the head of, he was the CEO, founder, and president of what, at the time at least, I think it's gone out of business, but at the time at least, it was a really well-regarded gourmet food store in Boston. And in the chapter about Stewart, the author was saying that whenever this guy, Stewart, would talk about my people or my guys, he'd get tears in his eyes. He was extremely committed to developing the people who worked for him. He was totally committed to their satisfaction as members of his organization. He paid very well. He gave them generous bonuses and vacation time, and they were absolutely dedicated to him and the store and the organization. Well, there was a great love between Stewart and the people that worked for him, the people who worked for him. So when he talked about my people or my guys, it was a real emotional kind of a term for him. Now, you could talk to another CEO and you might say, well, tell me a little bit about your people. And the CEO might go, my people? I have a lot of men and women who work for me, but they're not my people. They're their own people, but they are committed employees, committed cast members. For that CEO, the term my people or my guys doesn't have that same meaning. As a matter of fact, it has kind of the opposite meaning. It's like, I don't have people. I have men and women who work for me. So you just want to pay attention to what the client's alive words are. What are the words? And you should identify a good 4 or 5. I mean, you could go crazy here and every little, eyebrow raise, oh, that's an alive word. No, we're talking about words that the person maybe pauses before saying or seems to savor as he or she says it. But you should have a list of about 3, 4, 5 of those that you can use as necessary. Again, it shows it shows that you're listening. It elicits buy-in from what you're proposing. It elicits trust from the client. Couple more. Listen for missing information. And here's all that means. Missing information just simply means information that is abstract, vague, fluff. Information that the word is so broad, the word is so abstract that you could go off in this direction trying to figure out what it means. The client goes off in this direction trying to figure out what it means. And that's not good when you're in different directions. So you want to listen for missing information, and then you want to recover it. You want to drill down into it. And the way we do that is just very simply asking some very intentional questions that on one hand are not unfamiliar to you, but on the other hand have one little sort of twist that you wouldn't necessarily think of. And I'll explain in just a moment. Drilling down means asking the kind of questions that you were taught in middle school journalism modules in English class, who, what, when, and where, and how. So when someone says something that's vague and you recognize that it could mean different things to different people, you're going to say, well, what precisely do you mean when you say X, Y, or Z? And on one hand, as I said, that's not strange to ask that. But the piece that you got to remember is to stick in a word like precisely. It's a narrower. It's a word that, other than consciously perhaps, trains the thinking of the client to specificity, to detail, to give you the concrete, non-abstract information you seek. So what precisely do you mean when you say blah, blah, blah? So you're telling me that every once in a while, people are absent, much to your surprise. When exactly does that happen? Under what circumstances precisely does that happen? How specifically do you know that something is happening? A moment ago, Mr. Client, you mentioned that there seemed to be some confusion at the end of every month. How exactly do you know that that's happening? What exactly are the indicators of confusion? Because when I think about that, I think how confusion maybe could be something else. I don't know. How exactly did you decide it was confusion? So this is the kind of question we're talking about. One of my favorites is when someone says, we have to do this, or we must do that, or we have no choice except but do this. You can say, well, that's interesting for me to know. What exactly would happen if you didn't do it? And then the other way around, we can't do this. We mustn't do this. We don't dare do that. Oh, okay, I think I'm following you. What exactly would happen if you did do it? So you're finding out this missing information, you're testing, you're drilling down, you're going for observable, measurable, actionable, sensory specific, concrete detail at all times. that brings us to the end of this lecturette. And I hope it was more et than lecture. And it's